In the grand halls of medieval England, where banners of gold and crimson swayed above stone walls, kings were not merely men but symbols of power, and queens not always women of choice but pawns of necessity. Thrones were built not only on armies and coin but on marriages, contracts that bound kingdoms together as tightly as chains. It was within this world of cold alliances and fragile treaties that a child, scarcely 6 years old, was dressed in silks too heavy for her small frame and given to a man nearly 5 times her age. To her family, she was a jewel to be traded. To the king, she was a symbol of union, a promise sealed in flesh and blood. To herself, she was still only a child, caught between the playthings of youth and the duties of a crown. The chroniclers of the time wrote of the glory of kings and the strength of kingdoms, but they rarely lingered on the quiet tragedy of girls torn from their childhoods. Their voices were soft, their memories silenced, their lives forgotten beneath the weight of politics. Yet behind every treaty signed in ink, there was a child who signed in innocence lost. This is the story of one such queen, a girl married at 6 to a king of 29, her name nearly erased from the chronicles of history, her suffering concealed beneath the glitter of the crown. She was both bride and prisoner, both symbol and sacrifice. She was the forgotten Queen of England. Welcome to Scroll Historian. Here we unroll the forgotten pages of the past, stories of power, fear and silence that history tried to hide. If you enjoy journeys into these hidden chapters, I invite you to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps keep history alive and ensures these stories reach others who seek to understand the shadows of the past. Now, let us begin. A child born to duty. She was born into a world where bloodlines carried more weight than breath itself. From the moment of her first cry, her fate was no longer her own. The cradle that held her was not a sanctuary of innocence, but a vessel prepared for duty. Each noble birth in medieval England was a calculation, every child a piece on the vast chessboard of dynasties. Her family saw not her laughter or her play, but the alliances her small hand might one day secure. To them, she was a dowry wrapped in swaddling cloth, a bond to be pledged before she could even speak. The very priests who baptized her whispered blessings not only of salvation but of opportunity, for in her birth they read the possibility of treaties, of titles, of thrones. Childhood, for her, was an illusion quickly stripped away. While other children of her age played in gardens, she was clothed in garments of state, trained in courtesy, and reminded with every lesson that her worth lay not in her will, but in her lineage. The lullabies sung to her were not songs of comfort, but warnings of expectation. Even her toys were chosen as symbols of what she must one day become. Thus, before her name was known, her life was claimed. She was not merely a daughter, nor even truly a child. She was a promise, one that belonged not to herself, but to her family, her realm, and the ambitions of men who would decide her path long before she could walk it. As the seasons passed, her world narrowed, not through her own choices, but through decisions spoken in halls she would never see. In royal courts, her name was whispered across long oak tables, her future weighed against maps and treaties. To her family, she was not a daughter to be cherished, but a pawn to be positioned with precision. Ambassadors and nobles spoke of her as if she were coin, a token to be exchanged in pursuit of peace or power. They debated her worth in titles and lands, never in laughter or innocence. Her childhood was counted not in years of play, but in negotiations inked with seals and signatures. Each day she grew, the noose of expectation tightened, drawing her closer to a fate she could neither imagine nor escape. By the time she reached her 6th year, the decision was already made. A husband had been chosen, not a boy near her age, not even a youth still on the cusp of manhood, but a king nearly 30 years old, a man seasoned in politics, war and desire. He did not see her as a child, for to him she was not one, she was a bride, a tool of state, a body to bind 2 realms together. And so, as she learned her letters and stumbled through her first steps of womanhood, her life was bound by promises she had never spoken. She had been born to duty, and duty now demanded the surrender of her childhood. The marriage contract. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not a union of hearts but of kingdoms. For the powerful, it was a tool sharper than any sword, capable of forging alliances or ending wars. And so when the ink dried upon the parchment, the fate of the 6-year-old girl was sealed. She was to become queen, not by choice, not by readiness, but by decree. The contract was drawn up by men in velvet and fur, their hands stained not by labour but by ink and ambition. Each line spoke of dowries and inheritances, of promises between crowns, of territories to be secured. Her name was there, inscribed like a signature of fate, yet she herself could not even read the words that bound her life. To prepare her, seamstresses draped her in gowns far too heavy for her small shoulders. Jewels were clasped around her neck, slipping down onto skin still soft with childhood. She was painted not as a child but as a bride, an image sculpted for the court to admire. To the watching nobles, it was ceremony. To her, it was bewilderment. When the day arrived, the church was filled with incense and chanting. The king, a man of 29, stood waiting with solemn pride, and beside him, the bride was led forward, a little girl whose hand was guided to his, her eyes wide beneath a veil that felt more like a shroud. The wedding was staged as a triumph, though beneath its splendour lay a quiet tragedy. Nobles crowded the church in silks and brocades, their voices echoing with hymns that masked the unease whispered behind closed doors. They spoke of unity, of God's blessing, of a bond to secure the realm. Yet, before their eyes stood not a woman ready for such vows, but a child who still clutched her dolls in secret. The king, robed in velvet and crowned with gold, lifted his hand to take hers. His touch was firm, his gaze fixed with the confidence of age and authority. She, in contrast, stood dwarfed by the weight of her gown, her small fingers trembling beneath the weight of his grasp. Her eyes searched the faces of those around her, but none returned her gaze with comfort. For them, she was no longer a daughter or a girl, she was a queen. When the vows were spoken, her voice was barely a whisper, coached to repeat words she did not understand. The Latin of the priest rolled through the vaulted ceiling, and the crowd murmured approval as the ritual concluded. The seal of marriage was fixed, not by love but by law, not by choice but by command. That night, as celebrations filled the palace halls with music and feasts, the child bride sat silent. Surrounded by laughter and toasts raised in her name, she was lost in a world too large for her, her innocence hidden beneath the crown that pressed upon her brow. A child in a palace of adults. Life in the palace was a world of ceremony, duty, and politics, a place where every word spoken and every gesture made carried consequence. For a grown monarch, it was a burden of state. For a 6-year-old girl, it was a maze of incomprehensible rituals. The marble floors echoed not with the laughter of play, but with the measured steps of courtiers and the rustle of velvet gowns. She was taught to sit in silence, to bow when addressed, to smile though she did not understand the cause. Tutors corrected her posture, maids draped her in layers of fabric that weighed more than her body, and priests filled her ears with lessons of obedience, loyalty, and piety. Each day that passed, the line between child and queen blurred until the child all but disappeared. In the great halls, men debated matters of war and law, while she was paraded as a symbol of unity. When ambassadors visited, she was placed beside the king. Her presence used to display stability. Few noticed the way her feet dangled above the floor when she sat upon the throne, or how her small hands fidgeted nervously in her lap. To the world beyond the palace walls, she was the Queen of England. To those within it, she was a tool, dressed in gold, adorned with jewels, but still only a child, enduring a role she could neither escape nor comprehend. In the vastness of the palace, her world grew strangely small. Surrounded by courtiers, servants, and guards, she was never truly alone, and yet she lived in constant isolation. The voices that reached her were commands, lessons, and formal greetings. Rarely did anyone speak to her as a child, with gentleness or affection. Her days followed a rhythm dictated by others. Tutors drilled her in languages and scripture, courtiers rehearsed her responses to visiting nobles, and priests reminded her that obedience was her highest virtue. At night she retired not to a nursery filled with toys, but to chambers heavy with tapestries and silence, where the flicker of candlelight could not dispel her loneliness. The court saw her as a symbol, but a symbol does not laugh or cry. When she faltered, she was corrected. When she showed fear, she was scolded. She learned quickly that her true self had no place within the palace walls. Her childhood became a memory she was forced to bury, hidden behind the mask of majesty that had been placed upon her too soon. And so, among adults who plotted, negotiated, and schemed, she remained a stranger, a child dressed as a queen, her voice unheard, her heart forgotten, her solitude deepening with every passing day. The king and his child bride. The man who stood beside her as husband and king was no innocent youth. At 29, he had already weathered battles, betrayals, and the burdens of rule. His face bore the lines of authority. His words carried the weight of command, and his desires were shaped not by tenderness but by ambition. To him, the child he had married was not a companion of equal standing, nor a partner in love. She was a pledge fulfilled, a vessel through which treaties were secured and dynasties preserved. In her small frame he saw not fragility but utility, a body dressed in silks that proclaimed alliance, a crown upon her head that strengthened his throne. The courtiers praised the union as a triumph, but even they could not ignore the unsettling contrast. At banquets, the king conversed with seasoned lords and generals, while beside him sat a girl whose feet barely touched the ground, her silence more eloquent than any words she could offer. Yet no one dared speak of the cruelty hidden within this arrangement, for to question it was to question the will of the crown itself. In the eyes of history, he was a monarch, upholding tradition. In the eyes of the child he married, he was a stranger, older, powerful, and forever beyond her comprehension. Their life together was not a marriage in the tender sense, but a performance staged for the court and for foreign eyes. At feasts she was seated beside him, her presence a reminder of alliances sealed. At processions, she rode in a carriage draped in banners, the people bowing not to the child she was, but to the crown she wore. To the king she was an emblem, a living seal of his authority. Behind closed doors, the imbalance was more stark. He occupied chambers filled with the business of state councillors, generals, and scribes. She was kept apart, her world confined to tutors, attendants, and the endless rehearsal of courtly manners. If he visited her, it was not for conversation or affection, but to remind the court that their bond was real, their union visible. The gulf between them was unbridgeable. He was a man of hardened ambition, she a child robbed of her play. Yet in the eyes of the realm, they were king and queen, bound by vows she had never chosen. Where he saw strategy, she felt only silence. Where he stood tall in the chronicles of history, she vanished into the margins. To the kingdom, the marriage was a triumph of politics. To the girl, it was a prison woven in gold, her childhood exchanged for a crown that weighed far heavier than her small shoulders could bear. Shadows of power and suffering. In the palace, shadows stretched far longer than the light of ceremony. Behind the glitter of banquets and the solemnity of processions, whispers flowed through corridors like poison. Courtiers speculated about the child queen, some pitying her fragility, others resenting the influence her mere presence brought to her family. To them, she was not a girl with fears and feelings, but a token that shifted the balance of power. Rival factions within the court used her name as a weapon. Every gesture she made, every word she spoke or failed to speak was interpreted as allegiance. If she smiled at one noble, it was taken as favor. If she failed to acknowledge another, it was branded as insult. She was caught in a game she could not understand, her innocence twisted into intrigue. Amid these schemes, her suffering grew in silence. She longed for comfort, for warmth, for a voice that would address her not as queen but as child. Yet such voices were absent. Her attendants bowed too deeply to offer sympathy, her tutors too stern to allow tenderness. Even the king, her husband, remained distant, his gaze fixed not upon her but upon the throne she represented. Thus she lived not only as a prisoner of her crown, but as a shadow within her own life, watched, judged, and manipulated, while her own voice was swallowed by the ambitions of others. As the years crept forward, the whispers grew louder. Some at court mocked the king for wedding a child, while others insisted the marriage was a triumph of strategy. Yet in every corner of the realm, the queen's youth was a subject of uneasy fascination. Songs and rumours painted her alternately as innocent lamb or dangerous pawn, never as the child she truly was. The court chroniclers, eager to flatter their sovereign, spoke of her grace and composure, praising her as if she were already a woman. But between the lines of their gilded words lay another story, one of a girl who rarely spoke in public, whose eyes betrayed fear when the weight of the crown pressed too heavily upon her brow. In the quiet of her chambers, isolation deepened. She had no companions of her own age, no playmates to soften her loneliness. Surrounded by adults who watched her every move, she grew within a cage of silks and ceremony. Even when laughter echoed through the palace halls, it was never her laughter. Her life was a silence hidden beneath the noise of power. The people saw a queen, the courtiers saw an instrument, but she herself remained unseen. In a world that demanded her obedience, her suffering was dismissed, her innocence forgotten, her name destined to fade from memory even as she lived. The forgotten legacy. History has a cruel habit of silencing those who suffer quietly. In the Chronicles of England, the young queen's name appears only in passing, a signature on a treaty, a note in a lineage, a fleeting mention in the shadow of her husband's reign. The records speak of the king's victories, his counsels, his heirs, but of the child he married they say little more than that she existed. Her story was never carved into stone or sung in ballads. No poet mourned her loneliness, no scribe recorded her tears. To the chroniclers, she was a footnote, her life reduced to the function she served in binding two powers together. Her voice, her suffering, her humanity, all erased by the same silence that had surrounded her since childhood. In the memory of her people, she faded like incense smoke in a vast cathedral. Few remembered the girl forced into silks at 6 years old, standing beside a man nearly 5 times her age. Fewer still questioned the cost of such unions, for in a world where politics reigned above all else, her childhood was considered a sacrifice both necessary and forgettable. She was queen, yet she was forgotten. A crown had been placed upon her head, but it had stolen her name, her life, and her story. The fate of the forgotten queen is not an isolated tragedy, but a mirror of an age where childhood was a luxury denied to those born into power. Her story reminds us that beneath every alliance, every treaty, every crown, there were lives shaped not by choice but by command. Girls like her were not daughters to be cherished, but instruments to be bartered, their innocence spent for the ambitions of men. Her silence is the silence of countless others erased from history, brides too young to understand their vows, queens who lived as symbols rather than as women, children whose voices were smothered beneath the weight of duty. Though her name fades from the chronicles, the truth of her suffering lingers in the spaces between the lines, whispering of a cost rarely acknowledged. To remember her is to confront the cruelty masked by ceremony, to see the child beneath the crown, and to acknowledge that the grandeur of kingdoms was often built upon the broken years of the innocent. She may be forgotten in the gilded pages of history, but in the shadows her story endures, a quiet warning of the price exacted when power devours childhood.